Archivist Thel had expected a number. The chamber of review aboard the Pilgrim of Ceres had been built for order. Its curved wall screens, its narrow tiers, its careful acoustics, even the dim blue wash of light across the stone-colored floor, were all meant to reduce blood and panic into sequence, category, and lesson. Thel trusted sequence. Thel trusted categories more than most Korathi did. They had preserved civilizations more than once. So when Sergeant Toman Orsic of the Human Marines was let in, left arm sealed in a pressure cast, throat still darkened by old bruising from a hard-suit collar, Thel asked the question that made sense. How many Raukh did you personally kill aboard Dovek Spindle? The Marine looked at the small tactical display standing between them. He did not bristle. He did not act offended. Thel had expected either modest reluctance or a predator's pride. Humans often made room for both. Instead, Toman glanced at the panel, then at the main wall beyond it, a screen built to show fleet actions. That one, he said. Thel's eyelids tightened. Sergeant, this is a direct question. It has a direct answer, Toman said. But if you want the true one, that screen is too small. He was tired enough to be honest and too tired to perform. That was what Thel noticed first. The human was not trying to craft a legend. He was trying to prevent the wrong lesson from becoming official. Commodore Seyfu Anwar, seated 2 tiers above with his hands folded, understood it at once. He had already reviewed the raw records during the approach from Beshk. He knew why the casualty projections attached to Dovek Spindle had caused 3 separate departments to reject them as corrupted data before reluctantly submitting them for confirmation. "Give him the wall," Anwar said. Thel signaled the technicians. The chamber darkened further. The small panel went black. The great screen woke and spread the station's schematic across half the room. Toman's gaze remained fixed on it for a moment. Not with triumph. With fatigue, memory, and a kind of annoyance that had survived the battle better than some men survived peace. "Start at the first thermal strike," he said. The image obeyed. Dovek Spindle came into view in clean rotation, all polished geometry and industrial asymmetry, orbiting the frozen moon Beshk like a needle turning slowly above a white eye. The station had never been graceful, only efficient. Refinery booms reached from its central spine. Cargo rings, docking vanes, and radiator sails made its silhouette change depending on the angle of light. It processed ice, metal, and reaction mass for the Pelagos compact frontier. Water left Dovek Spindle as drinking supply, propellant feed, industrial coolant, and radiation shielding. Refined metals left it as hull stock, cable, construction scaffold, and ammunition. Whoever controlled that station could feed fleets and shape trade lanes without firing another shot. That was why the Raukh Dominion had come. On the screen, Thel watched the first wave cross the dark. The Raukh did not open with a dramatic broadside. Their commanders were more patient than that. They arrived under silent thrust in a formation shaped by mathematics and appetite. Their lead ships aimed not for the habitat ring or command core, but for the station's external heat rejection network. Thel had read the preliminary reports. Knowing and seeing were different things. Bright spears lanced across the vacuum. Panels as long as city streets folded, flashed white, and tore loose from Dovek Spindle's flank. One radiator array spun away, still glowing red along its broken roots. Another simply ceased to exist, atomized into a rapidly cooling veil. Thel heard someone inhale sharply behind him. It was not fear of weapons fire. It was recognition. Every spacer in the chamber knew what the first strike meant. In air, heat was annoying until it became fatal. In space, heat was a schedule, a budget, a ceiling. A ship could armor its hull and harden its electronics, but if it could not shed waste heat, every active system became a deadline. Thrusters, weapons, life support pumps, targeting computers, shielded coils, even the muscles inside a breathing body all contributed to the tally. A vessel that lost radiator area did not explode on cue. It suffocated more slowly and more cruelly, cooked by its own usefulness. The Raukh had begun by cutting time itself away from the station. Dovek Spindle's exterior feeds vanished one after another. Comms antennae were next. Sensor blisters burst. Docking ring 3 lost pressure in a spray of silver vapor. Boarding darts followed, punching into the outer industrial sections with ugly, efficient impacts. Thel looked down toward Toman. The human's expression did not change, but he was no longer in the chamber. He was back in the moment before alarms, back in a cargo spine that smelled of hot metal, antiseptic foam, and old ice dust. At the hour when the attack began, Toman Orsic had been not in the barracks but inside maintenance lock 12, arguing with Dock Chief Urim about lashing tolerances on a pallet of ore casings. That was another human trait Thel had once found excessive. They let everyone have opinions outside formal authority. Urim, a Toleran with copperhide folds around his eyes and the patience of a glacier, was chief of docking schedules, tug routes, cargo sequences, and bay safety. Toman was an infantry sergeant temporarily assigned to station security. Under Kwarathi doctrine, those jobs touched but did not mix. On Dovek Spindle, they mixed every hour. "If you stack them like that," Toman had said, one gloved hand tapping the crate webbing, "they'll ride clean in standard spin, but if we lose rotation balance, they'll walk." "We are not going to lose rotation balance," Urim had replied. His voice always sounded as though stones were rolling against each other at depth. "You say that every time. And every time I am right." "Sure." The alarm had interrupted them. For an instant both males froze, not from indecision but from professional calculation. Toman counted station sectors. Urim counted docked hulls and unsecured mass. Each knew that if his own fear ruled first, others might die of the things only he had noticed. Then the deck kicked under them with the first external hit. Neither man asked what the other intended. That, too, was part of why humans altered every place they served. They trained everyone around them to move before certainty arrived. On the wall screen, the station schematics blossomed red along outer sectors. Boarding penetration points appeared, then multiplied. Compact defenders were scattered and specialized. The Habitat Ring security teams moved towards civilian shelters. Reactor technicians sealed power lanes. Dock crews fought to secure spin imbalance before loose cargo turned the interior into a storm of steel. Medics prepared triage. What the defenders lacked was a mind linking all those efforts. Thiel saw when Toman became that link. Not because anyone appointed him, because he understood the station as one machine. On the recording, Toman grabbed the nearest wall handset, while Urim was already rerouting 2 cargo tugs by touch across a failing control board. "Security to all industrial sections," Toman said. "Ignore default shelter maps for rings 2 through 4. If you're near refinery spines, get to hard bulkheads and water tanks. Not pressure curtains. Tanks." A voice crackled back in outrage. "You are not command." "No," Toman said. "But I know what happens if we take a reactor-side hit with the radiators gone. Move." He was right. Water did not merely keep people alive. Packed in volume, it blocked radiation better than most structural materials available in a civilian station. Every old orbital culture had learned the same lesson. Early habitats, deep space ships, and transfer stations had all hidden their sleeping quarters and emergency refuges behind water jackets or fuel tanks long before elegant materials arrived. Humanity remembered that history, because humans had once survived in orbit by making engineering do double duty. Liora Fenn remembered it too. On the screen she appeared in a medical bay no larger than a freight car, already pulling emergency packs from the cabinets with hard, quick motions. She had served on rescue ships before taking the compact contract. She knew the rhythm of failure in sealed places. Panic was not her concern. Panic came later. First came noise, smoke, wrong numbers, bleeding, and the need to improvise with whatever had mass, tape, and a reliable seal. When Toman's warning hit her station channel, she did not waste time asking why. She looked once at the layout, saw where the nearest thermal exchangers had gone dark, and understood. "Move the recovery ward," she snapped. "Now, against the cistern wall. Not the windows. Anybody still standing, grab bags and start stripping non-essential fabric. If we lose temperature control, we layer insulation before we treat comfort." A young attendant stared at her. "This is a clinic, not a shelter." "It's both now," Liora said. She was not born to military calm. Few humans were. Their steadiness came from practice, memory, and the knowledge that fear could wait until after the next task. Her heart was already driving fast enough to shake the fine muscles at the corners of her eyes. Her mouth tasted metallic. Adrenal glands buried above the kidneys were flooding her blood with old animal chemistry, glucose and urgency, sharpening some functions and dulling others. Alien medics had once described the human emergency response as crude. Many stopped calling it crude after seeing what a trained human could do while riding it. Boarding alerts rolled across the screen. The Raukh had entered. They were broad through the torso, built around thick central mass, and powerful rear limbs evolved for violent bursts in heavy gravity. Their armor emphasized forward assault, helmet ridges sheltering sensory fans, and jaw plates flaring down like axe heads. In close action they were excellent. Their doctrine reflected it. Cut the structure. Isolate the defenders. Overrun section by section. Apply concentrated force until resistance became local and therefore disposable. The same doctrine made them predictable to someone who studied systems. Thel saw Toman glance over a cargo map, while sprinting down a half-lit corridor with 3 other Marines and 2 refinery workers who had grabbed tools because no weapons were available. He did not think, I can stop them here. He thought, if they're pushing from Dock 3 and cutting heat sinks, they want Hammerline intact. That thought changed the battle. Hammerline had been built as a giant linear launcher along Dovek Spindle's spine. In peacetime it flung bulk cargo and construction masses into adjusted transfer lanes with exquisite efficiency. In war it could punch through ships. Unfortunately, it had been designed by a compact that still believed industrial sites would be defended by proper fleets, not seized from within by enemies willing to board under the guns. If the Raukh got its control throat and power feed, they could point the station's own mass against whatever relief force came for it. Toman keyed an internal line that should not have answered. It answered because Urim had already bypassed 2 authorization locks in another section and decided he would apologize later if any superiors survived to hear it. Urim. They're going for Hammerline, Toman said. I know. You got tug control? For some tugs. I need all loose canisters tagged for quick release. A pause. Which canisters? All the ones you keep yelling at me about. Slag, ice, mirror film, powdered stock, anything under manual clamp. Spread pattern, not dump. Even under attack, Urim felt the instinctive pain of a dock chief hearing a cargo plan described by an infantryman. His first thought was that it was madness. His second thought, faster and colder, was to ask what kind. Explain. Toman ducked as rifle fire stitched sparks from a hatch frame behind him. He returned 2 shots without looking. One Raukh boarder folded backward out of the smoke. Another vanished as a refinery worker slammed the emergency shutter down. They need clean approach lanes and clean sensor picture, Toman said. We take both. Small pushes, stagger release times, use station drift and sun angle. Urim did not need more. He had spent a lifetime moving unwanted mass through vacuum. Any dock chief worth his rank knew that in orbit there were no small mistakes, only delayed ones. A crate nudged by a hand's breadth per second could become a collision threat if given enough time. A snow of ice crystals could blind a cheap lidar net. A sheet of torn reflective film could mimic geometry that did not exist. The station was surrounded by weapons already. They were just not shaped like weapons yet. I can give you dirty space, Urim said. Give me layered dirty space. Urim's throat flexed once with grim satisfaction. That is a much better order. Thel had studied human war records before. This part still unsettled him. Other species often praised human courage because courage was visible. What hid beneath it was more dangerous. Humans were generalists under pressure. They connected plumbing to tactics, cargo to cover, biology to morale, and history to survival. They did not always respect the boundaries that kept expertise tidy. Sometimes that made them difficult. Sometimes it saved stations. On the wall, Dovek Spindle began to change. From a distance, the first releases looked like damage. Cargo clamps blew. Cylinders drifted free. Mirror film bundles opened like silver flowers. Slag tubs vented dark particulate that spread in a widening lace across orbital space. Ice canisters cracked and vented glittering clouds. Not much, not all at once. Just enough to create confusion. Raukh pilots adjusted. Their thermal systems, already pushed by combat posture with partial radiator loss, worked harder to parse noise from threat. Thrusters flashed. Targeting routines reacquired and reacquired again. In the chamber, Thel found himself leaning closer. Toman had not thrown garbage into space. He had written delays into the enemy's future. That had been the idea behind Operation Latchfire, though the name itself would not exist for another hour. Toman did not think in grand operation titles while under fire. He thought in thresholds. How much confusion could buy how much time? How much time could reposition how much mass? How much mass, moving on correct vectors, could become how much hazard? He fought, as he calculated. The recordings shifted inward, following him through Dovek Spindle's industrial arteries. He was good in close quarters, though that was not what made him extraordinary. He moved with a spacer's economy. No wasted swings in low gravity, no dramatic lunges that would spin him off balance. He used handholds, bulkhead corners, and short bursts of mag boot adhesion in exactly the ways early orbital trainers had taught generations of workers and soldiers. 3 points stable if possible, muzzle discipline always. Know where recoil sends you if the deck vanishes. Earth had given humanity bones and muscles. Space had taught it manners. At one junction, Toman and his 3 Marines held a cross corridor against twice their number. Thel could read the Raukh intent plainly. They wanted the defenders fixed while a secondary team cut through maintenance above them. Toman saw it too. He heard the vibration through the vent frame and knew the tools. Boarding cutters made distinct sounds depending on how much haste and how much finesse their operators used. 2 overhead in under a minute, he said. One of his Marines, barely old enough to have settled into his own armor, glanced upward and swallowed. How do you know? Because they think we're smarter than we look, Toman said, which means they're going to do the smart thing. He tossed the younger man a coil of anchor line. When the panel goes, pull hard and left. Don't be brave, be useful. The panel blew. The line jerked. A Raukh dropped into the kill box and was yanked sideways by his own momentum, colliding with the bulkhead hard enough to stun him before Toman's shot took him out. The second boarder came down firing and hit only sparks because Toman had already moved to where the recoil of his previous burst had carried him. That was another lesson the future war colleges would note. Humans trained close combat in artificial gravity and freefall together. They built doctrine from the assumption that decks lied. Compact species more accustomed to stable internal gravity often treated those domains separately. At the same time, elsewhere aboard the station, Liora Fenn was turning a clinic into a survival school. She directed civilians, technicians, and lightly wounded defenders into pressure pockets built from storage curtains, emergency foam, and stacked water drums. She forced people to drink when shock made them forget thirst. She stripped decorative wall panels for insulation backing. She assigned one conscious patient with a broken wrist to read pulse ox numbers aloud because frightened people obeyed routines better when the routine sounded medical. She turned IV warming sleeves into hand and neck wraps for cold-stressed children. She taught a Harn machinist how to recognize the first signs of dangerous heat exhaustion after life support irregularities sent temperatures swinging in one section and plummeting in another. The Harn found humans unsettling in triage because they would explain while acting. Most species separated expertise from comfort. Liora joined them. "Listen," she told him while tightening a seal band over a refinery worker's chest. "When people overheat in a sealed environment, they stop making good decisions before they stop moving. If they get confused, slow, reckless, or weirdly cheerful, tell me. Don't wait for collapse. Your species does that." "Everybody does something," Liora said. "We just wrote more manuals about it." That was true as far back as Earth's old deserts, submarines, mines, and orbital stations. Human survival literature had grown from disasters as much as victories. The species remembered what almost killed it, and turned the memory into checklists. On the opposite side of Dovek Spindle, Captain Beshk of the Hern was discovering that his cargo escort, disabled but not dead, could still matter. Beshk had spent his career regarding human military confidence with skeptical tolerance. Humans often sounded certain while still improvising. Hern culture considered that halfway to irresponsibility. Yet when Raukh boarders hit his docked escort and severed his bridge from primary thrust, it was a human voice that came over emergency channel with a question none of his own people had thought to ask. "Captain, can you still yaw on your port maneuver ring?" Beshk had blinked his wide-set eyes at the dead screens and answering fire in his own corridors. "Barely." "Good. Don't use it yet. I need you angry and patient. Who is this? Toman Orsic. Why would I take combat advice from station security? Because the enemy thinks your ship is useless, Toman said. Can you keep them thinking that? Beshk could. Fury settled into respect, thin and unwilling but real. He shut down what little remained of his active signature and let his escort sag against its clamps like a carcass. Under that mask he preserved the one maneuver ring Toman needed for later. Meanwhile, far beyond the station, Commodore Sefu Anwar drove the Pilgrim of Ceres harder than safety margins liked. He had command of a relief group too small for comfort and too far for certainty. Tactical overlays in his command deck bloomed with bad news: broken comms, thermal degradation, probable boarding success, incomplete count of enemy hulls. Younger officers wanted maximum burn. Older ones wanted caution. Anwar wanted arithmetic. He knew space travel too well to romanticize speed. Propellant was not wishful thinking. Thrust was not free. A ship that rushed into combat with overheated drive sections and exhausted thermal reserve arrived fast and died hot. Human fleets had learned that from centuries of engines that always promised a little more than they safely gave. Even the best future drives still ended in waste heat and structural stress. Not full burn, Anwar said. A lieutenant looked stricken. Sir, the station may not last. It definitely won't last if we arrive blind and unable to fight, Anwar replied. His voice was even, but his mind was racing through old academy principles and old family memory. He had been raised among people who treated fuel, water, and patience as sacred because empty space did not forgive bad accounting. We pulse, keep the radiators within the envelope. Titan cycle discipline. I need every gun alive when we get there. Then we're conceding time. We're buying capability, Anwar said. Get me updated passive tracks on every vector from Vesker, and open a narrow beam burst for Dovek Spindle every time the geometry allows it. If anyone on that station can still hear us, I want them to know how long they need to hold. He did not know yet that one of the men hearing him would turn hold into trap. Back in the review chamber, Thel listened to Anwar's own recorded voice crackling through static over the wall speakers. Relief force en route. Earliest arrival 1 orbital cycle plus. Preserve Hammerline if possible. If not possible, deny it. The message reached Toman in a maintenance cage hanging beside the launcher's spine, where he, Urum, and 2 sweating power techs were trying to decide which systems mattered more: structural stability, fire control, or survival. "Did you hear that?" one of the techs asked. "Yes," Toman said. "He said deny it if we have to." Urum's heavy hands never stopped moving across the manual couplings. "You are wondering whether he means destroy it." The tech looked from one to the other. "Don't you?" Toman thought of the station's civilians. He thought of the cargo reservoirs. He thought of the moon below, bright and silent. He thought of the raw certainty that if they pressed hard enough, the battle would become simple. "No," he said. "I think he means don't let them use it the way they planned." That was the moment Operation Latchfire became an actual plan. The name came from Urum, surprisingly enough. Toman had started laying out vectors on a greaseboard with a marker that barely wrote through his shaking hands. Urum watched him place released cargo, dead tugs still clamped ore masses, and the station's own slow drift into a pattern. "You are building a gate out of junk," the Talaran said. "A moving one. A latch." Toman looked up. Urum bared his blunt teeth in what passed for dry humor among his kind. "And you intend to set it on fire." The human almost smiled despite the noise of distant gunfire. Operation Latchfire, then. It spread quickly through the defense net because people needed names for impossible things before they could believe in them. Thel saw the operation unfold from angles no single participant had possessed during the fight. That was why the screen mattered. On a small panel, each action had looked local. On the wall, intent emerged. Toman ordered selective withdrawals from sectors that mattered less than they appeared to matter. He left medical signs in some passages and stripped them from others, letting the Raukh infer where civilians had been concentrated. He allowed a repeated, apparently desperate pattern of resistance around Hammerline access, not strong enough to repel the enemy, only strong enough to convince them they were approaching the true center of command. Raukh commanders reading this through their own logic concentrated pressure exactly where Toman wanted it. They did so because they were not fools. That was important. The story of Dovek Spindle was not one of stupid enemies. The Raukh were excellent soldiers. They were simply applying excellence through assumptions that humans had already learned to violate. They believed specialists stayed in role. They believed Doc Clutter remained Doc Clutter. They believed fear narrowed options. They believed damaged stations became less capable the longer a battle continued. Humans often became more dangerous once the proper systems failed. By the midpoint of the siege, Dovek Spindle was operating on handoffs, shouted updates, and the kind of improvised trust that made Quarthy administrators uneasy. Yet each subsystem Toman touched began to support another. Cargo became cover, water became shielding, clinic space became command node, a disabled escort became hidden leverage, heat damage became a weapon, because it was happening to both sides. The first clear proof came when a cluster of Raukh's skiffs accelerated through what should have been a safe lane near Dock 3. Hours earlier, Urum had vented powdered refinery stock into a spread too thin to threaten armor. Toman had timed that spread against station spin and the angle of sunlight off Vesker's ice sheen. At the moment the skiffs entered it, their sensors flared with false brightness from mirror film and metal particulate. Their pilot feeds lost depth accuracy for less than a second. In atmosphere, that would have been nothing. In orbital close maneuver, it was enough. One skiff clipped an apparently empty ice canister moving only a little off-plotted drift. The canister ruptured. The skiff rolled, overcorrected, and drove its wing assembly through the path of the next craft. Both spun. Their escorts broke formation to avoid debris, firing lateral thrusters in panic. Hot gas, bright against damaged sensor nets, made the confusion worse. At that exact instant, Captain Beshk woke his dead ship. His escort twisted on the one preserved maneuver ring, not enough to break free, only enough to shove a docked gantry 2 degrees off true. That gantry had already been weakened by earlier fire. It tore loose and swung across the lane like a steel pendulum in slow nightmare. A third skiff died on it. A fourth sheared away, trailing atmosphere. Back in the chamber, several officers muttered aloud. On the tactical display, the event looked less like combat than a disaster among dockyards. Thel knew why the official casualty ledger had resisted attribution. Who had destroyed those craft? Beshk, Urum, Toman, the sun, the laws of motion? Toman spoke without taking his eyes from the screen. That cluster was when they stopped trusting their own approach math. Thel believed him. Fear in space was often technical before it was emotional. Once crews lost faith in their numbers, every shadow thickened. Still, Dovek Spindle was not winning. It was surviving by spending itself. The station's internal atmosphere had become patchwork. Some sections stank of hot plastic and scorched lubricant. Others had gone knife-cold. Gravity in the habitat ring wavered as rotation compensation struggled. Civilians huddled behind tanks and bulkheads, while distant impacts spoke through the structure like hammer blows inside bone. Liora Fen moved through it all with a face gone flat from concentration. She had seen enough triage to know the point at which exhaustion begins making kind people stupid. Humans like to imagine that bravery was a constant reservoir. It was not. It was a resource that had to be managed like battery charge, blood volume, and breathable air. So she instituted sleeping shifts that looked absurd under siege. 15 minutes here, 20 there. Anyone objecting was told bluntly that the brain, deprived too long, started lying to itself. Human circadian rhythms were adaptable, but not magical. Training let people function under broken sleep and wrong lighting far better than many species. It did not make them immune to decline. One refinery foreman protested that no one could sleep with gunfire in the walls. Liora handed him a folded thermal blanket. "Close your eyes and prove me wrong." He obeyed. He slept in 4 minutes. When Toman finally reached the clinic shelter during a lull, Liora took one look at him and put a protein gel in his hand before speaking. "I don't have time." "You have 20 seconds," she said. He swallowed half the gel in 2 grim bites. "Hammerline still stands. For now. I need half your water reserve moved to Spine Junction 9. That reserve is shielding. It will be shielding there, too." She studied him, reading stress, dehydration, and intent. "Why 9? "Because if the Raukh get through outer choke, they'll cut across the maintenance bend. 9 covers the only line from there to the launcher throat. And because I want them to think I'm protecting something more important behind it." Her eyes sharpened. "You are. Not what they think." Liora knew better than to ask for the entire plan in the middle of battle. Humans could work like that with each other. Broad trust, fast updates, no wounded pride about missing pieces. She nodded once. Done. Sit. I said I don't have time. I heard you. Sit anyway. He sat because his legs were beginning to tremble when he stopped moving, and because some part of him, buried under training and urgency, still recognized Liora's tone from field medics older and smarter than himself. She checked his pupils, seal line bruising, and blood oxygen while shouting instructions over her shoulder to a volunteer moving canisters. You're cold-stressed, overheated, underslept, and one bad hit away from making a glorious mistake, she said. Drink. He drank. Your species is very bossy, said Urum, arriving with soot across one cheek fold and 3 data slates under one arm. Liora did not look up. That is why you are still alive. Urum considered this and decided not to argue. The next phase began when the Raukh finally pushed deep enough to glimpse Hammerline's primary access spine. Thiel watched the border feeds with growing unease. The enemy advance was relentless, disciplined, and close now. Corpses floated or lay anchored in the bends, human and alien, Raukh and compact together in the democratic stillness of the dead. Smoke globules drifted in vacuum leaks. Emergency lights turned every passage into a wound. Toman had been counting angles more than bodies. His personal kills, even by conservative review, were already substantial. He knew it and barely cared. Each engagement was only useful insofar as it bent the next one. That was what made Thale's original question so narrow. On the screen, the human positioned defenders around Spine Junction 9 behind stacked water drums and maintenance pallets. The arrangement seemed almost comic until the first Latchfire hit and the drums bulged, ruptured, and drank energy that might have cut through flesh. Water sprayed into the corridor, flashing into glittering beads in the dropping pressure. What had been protection a second before became visibility hazard, slip trap, and refractive clutter. The Raukh surged into it anyway, believing momentum would carry them through. Toman let them come farther than any standard manual approved. Now, he said. Urum vented an access seal behind the attackers. The pressure differential was not enough to suck armored soldiers away like a storybook gale. Vacuum did not work theatrically. What it did do was turn free water beads, insulation scraps, and loose tool fragments into chaotic fast movers while knocking one step of footing out from under bodies already committed to forward rush. In that stutter, defenders fired from 3 angles. The choke held. For 9 minutes. Then it broke. Thale had anticipated the next part and still felt tension knot through him as Hammerline access alarms flared bright across the wall. Raukh teams forced the secondary ladder shaft. A defender's grenade took half the rung assembly with it, but enough borders crossed. One of Toman's Marines died trying to stop them. Another was dragged back by his anchors, firing until his weapon clicked empty. Toman saw the collapse and made the decision that later would be studied longer than any single shot he fired. He ordered the final inner corridor abandoned. Not because it could not be held a little longer. It probably could. But holding it would teach the Raukh caution. Toman wanted greed. The retreat looked bad on camera. Even Anwar, watching the old feed in the chamber, felt again the sick certainty he had experienced at the time that Hammerline might already be lost. Raukh boarders flooded into the launcher throat control section. They found wrecked consoles, scattered casualty packs, abandoned drink flasks, and 3 surviving human defenders fleeing through an aft service hatch. Thiel knew now what those defenders had left behind. They had left behind exactly the repairs the enemy wanted to see. Hammerline looked crippled but recoverable. Manual control pathways had been exposed. Auxiliary capacitors had been rerouted just enough to seem salvageable. Guidance rails were dirty but not disabled. To a victorious assault team, it suggested that the defenders had been desperately trying to bring the weapon back online for one last use, and had failed at the final moment. The Raukh commander on scene committed more of his strength to the capture. Latchfire closed. Outside the station, the debris field Urum and Toman had been building for hours reached maturity. The station's slight attitude changes, achieved by venting mass and shifting tug thrust at carefully chosen intervals, had altered the relationship between Hammerline, the main enemy support ships, and a drifting cluster of industrial cargo that had once been harmless feedstock. Inside, Toman and Beshk suited for the exterior crawl that would decide whether any of it mattered. That part had not been in the original plan. Most victories are patched from things no one wanted to attempt. Hammerline's final manual release assembly had jammed half-closed when a support member warped under heat stress. Without clearing it, the launcher could not fire. Automated systems were dead. Interior access was lost to the borders. The only route was across the station's skin. Captain Beshk volunteered before Toman asked. He did so because he had become convinced of something he would later describe with embarrassment. The human was either right or so wrong that staying alive elsewhere would be pointless. In Hirn culture, that was close enough to loyalty. The exterior camera feeds were half-blind, but the wall screen gave just enough. Two suited figures emerged onto Dovek Spindle's black metal flank, tether lines snaking after them. Vesker turned below, white and remote. Sunlight hit one side of the hull like a blade, while the other vanished into cold without mercy. No one who had not worked outside a damaged structure truly understood how much motion there was in crawling through vacuum. Every push sent reaction somewhere. Every tether tug had to be anticipated. Every piece of debris, however small, was a bullet if relative velocity was wrong. Even temperature fought you. Shade could bite through layered protection. Sunlit metal could turn contact patches treacherous. Human extravehicular procedures, inherited from old orbital labor before military glory dressed them up, had always emphasized boring details, because boring details kept people from spinning away to die. Toman moved like a dockhand, because that was partly what he had been before the Marines shaped him into something more dangerous. He clipped, checked, braced, and called every movement. Beshk, heavier and less practiced in such external work, trusted the rhythm and matched it. They crossed a section where micrometeor shielding had peeled back in ribbons under earlier fire. "Why not target the command ship?" Beshk asked over suitcom, breath rough in Thel's speakers. "Because that's what they expect," Toman said. "It is also the largest target, not the most vulnerable." Beshk understood the answer a second before Thel did. The Hirn captain had spent longer commanding ships than the Archivist had spent studying them. "Heat," Beshk said. "Heat," Toman agreed. The Raukh support ships had taken combat posture early, folding protected thermal surfaces and leaning on internal heat sinks to survive the exchange. Their damaged radiators and overworked cooling loops had become silent liabilities. The enemy could still fight if the battle resolved quickly. Toman intended to deny them quick. Hammerline did not need to destroy the heaviest ship. It needed to turn the industrial cargo cloud into the wrong kind of environment. Under them, the jammed release assembly glowed dull through cracked insulation. Toman anchored. Beshk planted himself with difficulty on a mag clamp line and used both hands to haul at the twisted member, while Toman cut and levered with a maintenance pry tool no war college would have chosen for a decisive moment. Inside the station, Raukh teams finally reached the launcher's core controls. They believed they had won. The lead commander ordered power synchronization and external fire solution on the incoming relief vectors. His crew worked fast and well. Their error was not incompetence. It was context. They did not realize the apparent recovery work around them had been staged to point their attention away from one thing Toman had actually fixed: a secondary remote firing line. Urim had restored it through cargo diagnostics 2 sections away, because no one looking for weapons control would think to check ore handling firmware. When Thel grasped that, he felt a rare Kwarathi sensation, close to awe and irritation at once. On the Pilgrim of Ceres back during the actual battle, Commodore Anwar had received only fragments. He saw enemy ships tightening near Dovek Spindle and thought he was too late. His staff prepared for a brutal engagement against a station turned hostile under Raukh control. Then Hammerline fired. Not at the command ship. The great launcher spat a dense industrial mass package that had been sitting for hours in a carefully adjusted drift, a cluster of refined metal stock, frozen water, and packed slag containers linked by work tethers. The first impact from the launcher's magnetic pulse shattered the cluster exactly as Toman intended. Not into a cinematic explosion, but into a savage expanding cloud of fragments crossing the enemy's maneuver plane at impossible closing speed. The wall screen showed it in silent geometry. Thin radiators sliced open, sensor masts vanished, thruster bells cored and deformed. Secondary armor held where it could, but armor was not the point. Thermal control surfaces were. One Raukh escort kept its hull intact and died anyway as coolant lines vented and internal temperatures rose beyond weapons tolerance. Another sheared thrust to avoid the cloud and collided with a sister ship, whose pilot had lost range data in the same instant. A third managed to turn broadside, presenting stronger plating, only to trap itself in a hotter orientation with too little radiator exposure left to manage the power spike of evasive maneuver. Inside their ships, Raukh crews suddenly found themselves in the oldest trap of space warfare. Systems had choices to make: fire guns, or breathe easier, burn hard, or keep electronics within survival range, chase targets, or stop the ship from killing itself. The assault broke shape. That was when Commodore Anwar arrived. The Pilgrim of Ceres and its escorts came over the dark on disciplined vectors, radiators spread within safe margin, weapons ready because Anwar had refused to cook his own ships for speed. His officers saw what Toman had done before their sensors fully believed it. Enemy formations were not destroyed cleanly. They were compromised, off balance, managing thermal crises and trajectory confusion at the worst possible moment. "Now full burn," Anwar said, and this time the order was worth the cost. His ship struck the outer Raukh screen, peeling it apart while Dovek Spindle, wounded and furious, continued to contribute ugly surprises from every surviving angle. Captain Beshk tore free of his dock clamps at last, and drove his half-dead escort into the flank of a boarding barge trying to withdraw. Vented 2 more cargo trains into escape lanes, not because it was elegant, but because fleeing pilots forced into fresh corrections under heat stress made mistakes. Liora kept the station's people alive long enough to hear that relief had arrived, and refused, even then, to celebrate until pressure and temperature stabilized. Inside Hammerline control, the Raukh commander understood too late that he had been maneuvered, not by a fleet admiral, but by the man he would have dismissed as a corridor fighter. He tried to reverse the launcher and was killed when one of his own panicked subordinates overloaded a crippled relay trying to restore command priority. The blast vented the compartment through the hatch Toman had left damaged on purpose. Even victory aboard a captured station required respecting the station. The Raukh had not. On the exterior hull, Toman and Beshk were still clinging to Dovek Spindle while the battle turned. Beshk laughed once over open comm when the enemy formation broke, not from joy but from the savage disbelief of a professional watching a gamble pay off. "You set the whole orbit on them," he said. Toman's reply came after a long breath. "I set the table." They sat down. By the time the wall screen reached the final phase, the chamber had gone very still. The tactical overlays tallied wrecked skiffs, dead boarders, disabled escorts, scuttled support hulls, and the chain of consequences leading from one Marine's decisions through dozens of hands and systems. Sel could now answer his own original question, but only by abandoning the form in which he had asked it. How many Raukh had Toman Orsic personally killed? In a corridor, quite a few. In a station, far more. In the battle as a whole, the answer could not be separated from Urum's releases, Liora's shelters, Beshk's hidden thrust, and Anwar's disciplined arrival. Human warfare, Sel realized, had a talent for making ownership of success annoyingly collective without erasing individual brilliance. The screen dimmed. Light rose gradually in the chamber. Sel looked down at the human Marine. Toman seemed smaller now than he had on the wall, one damaged man with exhaustion dug deep behind the eyes. That too was instructive. History often returned to ordinary shapes after doing extraordinary work. "I asked the wrong question," Sel said. Toman shrugged once, then winced because the movement pulled at his cast. "You asked the easy one. There was no insolence in it, only truth." Commodore Anwar leaned forward. "Then let's ask a better one." Sel folded all 4 hands together. He had been educated, and Korathi valued accurate gratitude almost as much as order. "Why?" he asked. "Are humans like this?" A tired smile finally touched Toman's mouth. Because he was tired, because the battle was over, and because he had no patience left for mystique, he answered plainly. "We grew up solving problems in places that wanted us dead," he said. "Vacuum, cold, heat, distance, bad air, bad numbers, broken gear. You learn fast that everything connects. Water is drink, shield, coolant, mass. Cargo is money, cover, momentum. A medic is also logistics. A dock chief is also artillery if he knows his vectors. If something goes wrong, you don't wait for the proper department to save you. You become the proper department until the emergency ends." No one in the chamber spoke for several seconds. Phil thought of all the Pelagos compact briefings that described humans as adaptable, unruly, cross-trained, and unusually persistent under strain. The words had always sounded dry. Dry words had failed the reality. Liora Finn entered near the back then, late to the session because she had been checking the last pressure recovery reports herself. Urum stood behind her, carrying a data slab as though it offended him personally. Captain Beshk had already been present in a side tier, bandaged and expressionless in the Harn manner that concealed grudging admiration. None of them looked like conquerors. They looked like survivors from a machine room fire, because that was closer to the truth. Thel turned to include them all. "Very well," he said. "The official record will reflect that Dovek Spindle was held by integrated defensive improvisation under extreme thermal and orbital constraints." Urum made a low sound. Thel tilted his head. "You disagree?" "It sounds dull," said the Talaran. A hint of laughter passed through the chamber, frayed and grateful. Commodore Anwar saved the report from dignity. "Add that if Raukh forces encounter humans on any station in the future, they are not to assume maintenance systems are non-combat assets." Beshk's heavy jaw shifted in what, for a Harn, counted as broad amusement. "Add cargo, too." "Add medbays," Liora said. Toman looked at the wall screen one last time. On it, frozen in pause, Dovek Spindle still turned above Vesker amid the drifting wreckage and glitter of a battle no one had expected it to survive. "Add everything," he said. The lesson moved outward faster than the repaired ships of the Pelagos Compact. At Dovek Spindle, broken compartments were sealed, the dead were named, and Hammerline was rebuilt with enough safeguards to offend half the engineers who designed them. The station remained in service because Frontiers never had the luxury of retiring what still worked. Farther away, Raukh's planners received a sharper kind of education. Their own records from Vesker were studied until a warning emerged that spread through the Dominion in clipped doctrinal language. If humans are present aboard an objective, do not assume the battle is limited to weapons in their hands. Assume they are already counting air, heat, mass, timing, and every loose object in reach. On the edge of settled space, that warning became as valuable as any fleet. And on more than one station in the Pelagos Compact, when some officer asked a human for a simple tally after an ugly fight, somebody else would mutter, with equal parts respect and concern, that they had better find a larger screen first.